I just want to welcome you to the webinar on human societal dimensions of a new carbon economy. I'm Natalie Mahowald. I'm a professor of atmospheric science here at Cornell University. I'm also a faculty director at the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future at Cornell University. As you know, today we're talking about the new carbon economy, and I wanted to introduce to you the goals of the project. There we go. So today for the webinar, what we're really trying to do is set the stage for a workshop that will occur in February. And we really want to brainstorm for this workshop here at this session. Now, once we're at the workshop, our goals are to bring together the researchers across all the disciplines that are studying the human and social dimensions, societal dimensions, that are critical to enabling carbon dioxide removal, utilization, and ultimately sequestration. We want to link socioeconomic research with the natural science and the engineering research, and to ensure that we actually get a research agenda that makes sense and can move forward so that these two research agendas co-evolve holistically. We want to establish a research agenda for the human and social side and outline fundable cross-disciplinary projects that could be used to collaborate with other institutions across, for example, the new Carbon Economy Consortium or universities in general in the US. So we've slightly changed the agenda. It'll be a little bit shorter, so I think everyone will be happy. We're going to have Jane Zelikova from the Carbon 180, which was formerly the Center for Carbon Removal. She's going to introduce the new Carbon Economy Consortium and the innovation plan that is in the process of being released. Then we'll have Kathy Kling, a professor here at Cornell University in Applied Economics and Management. And she's also a faculty director in the Atkinson. And she's going to talk about why we need to have a workshop looking at the human and societal dimensions. Now, what we're going to do is ask you not to ask questions verbally, but rather to put them into the chat window. And Jane will also have a survey as part of her talk. So, and then we'll moderate. So the questions will come at the end of each of the speakers. So if you have clarifying questions, feel free to enter them into the chat window, and I will try to read them at the end of Jane's presentation as well as Kathy's presentation. And then at the very end, it's going to be a brainstorming session. We really want all of your ideas to come across at that point. All right, so at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Zelikova, a senior scientist it's now Carbon 180, and she's going to talk to you more about what has been going on already with the new carbon economy.
Okay, so thank you so much. I want to first start by thanking Cornell University and the Atkinson Center for helping pull together this webinar and help us develop a social science agenda around the new carbon economy. So my name is Jane, and I'm going to talk to you about the new Carbon Economy Consortium, introduce what it is, introduce who Carbon 180 is. So Carbon 180, formerly the Center for Carbon Removal, hopefully you've heard of us, and if not, I'm happy to introduce us. We are a different kind of NGO. So we are located, headquartered in Oakland, California, but we have folks that live in Colorado, which is where I live, and also in Chicago. And we are explicitly working on rethinking carbon and with harnessing the power of plants and machines to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And the way that we do that is we focus on bringing scientists, policymakers, and businesses together. So what sets us apart from other climate-focused NGOs is that we have an expressive interest in working with businesses to ensure that the climate solutions that we put forward are ones that actually can work for the economy, grow the economy, and bring profit so that the climate solutions are actually sustainable. So who is the new Carbon Economy Consortium, and what is the new Carbon Economy Consortium? Well, it's a group of partnering institutions, national labs, and some corporate partners who are coming together to build a kind of a virtual lab for carbon. So we kind of realized that the carbon removal agenda and the climate mitigation agenda is really large, interdisciplinary, and it's going to require the efforts, the knowledge generation, the ingenuity of a lot of people that are probably spread through a lot of different institutions. So we brought together an initial founding group that includes Arizona State University, Colorado State, Columbia, Cornell, the Energy Futures Initiative, University of Wyoming, Howard University, University of British Columbia, Purdue, and then the Colorado School of Mines, as well as 2 national labs, which is really great to have NREL and Lawrence Livermore National Lab on board. And the goal of the New Carbon Economy Consortium is to bring ingenuity and innovation to enable a prosperous, growing economy, one that is capturing and storing more carbon than it emits. So it's really a marriage of innovation and technology and science with economics and a social science agenda, which is why we're here today. So the New Carbon Economy Consortium is in kind of its initial stages. And what it's doing is it's bringing together 3 distinct pieces. The first is the new knowledge creation in order to bring together the research agenda around carbon removal. We need to create a lot more knowledge. We need to invent new ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere, or we need to develop new means of measuring carbon in the soil. The New Carbon Economy Consortium is also working to figure out what the economic benefits are of the different solutions that are being developed and speed up the process of scaling solutions and bringing them to market. And all of this needs to be with the goal of climate change mitigation. So if the solutions are not actually removing carbon and they're not mitigating climate change, then they are not solutions that that will be included in the New Carbon Economy Consortium research agenda. And if you want to read more about the New Carbon Economy, you can go to carbon180.org and click on New Carbon Economy, and you can find out a lot more about the consortium and also see the report that was just released last week, which is called the Innovation Plan. And that lays out a really robust research agenda that I'm going to talk about in a minute here. So what is the Innovation Plan? So the New Carbon Economy Consortium came together in June of 2017. And for the past year, we've been working on developing an innovation plan, or you might call it a research roadmap. And it's really the first product of the consortium, and it sets an ambitious research agenda to find carbon removal solutions that can, 1, remove carbon in pretty large volumes and pretty rapidly, 2, can create economic value, and 3, require collaboration and significant research infrastructure to bring these solutions to fruition. That is to say that these solutions require a consortium and can't be done by any one institution alone. So the pathways to carbon removal that are discussed in the innovation plan include engineered solutions, biological solutions, and hybrid solutions. And I'll talk about those in detail. So for engineered solutions, we focused on technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the air and also from oceans, and in the process create economic value by producing products or carbon removal services. So that is technologies that capture, convert, and use or store CO2. And that I just want to say that each of these chapters were written by a team of authors who are experts in the topic. So for engineered solutions, it was experts in direct air capture and CO2 conversion and utilization, and also topics like accelerated weathering and mineral carbonation. So the engineered solutions chapter lays out an ambitious research agenda that isn't in any way comprehensive. It doesn't cover every single engineered solution to carbon removal, but it focuses on solutions that the authors felt had the most potential for rapid scaling that could benefit from a lot of focused research that could be done by a consortium instead of any one institution or one research lab. And similarly, other chapters were approached the same way, so that they were not comprehensive reviews of all the solutions that exist, but really focused on solutions that we thought were innovative, that needed to be scaled more quickly. So for biological solutions, the chapter focused on practices and approaches that remove carbon dioxide from the air and at the same time improve both ecological and economic sustainability. and really focused on agriculture and forestry as the two areas where biological solutions have meaningful impact. So in that chapter, we focused on 3 large areas where there's a lot of potential to remove carbon. One is restoration and forest management. The second topic was soil carbon sequestration in agriculture. And the third was lots of different kinds of soil amendments and approaches to nutrient management that can both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote more carbon storage in soils. And then for hybrid solutions, this was a chapter that was really cross-cutting. And what the chapter was about is bringing together both technology and biology to yield services and products from biomass that can remove carbon from the air and from the ocean. And so the hybrid solutions chapter included terrestrial bioenergy, biochar, and also aquatic and terrestrial algae in biological communities. So there was some discussion about microbial pathways as well. So in the bioenergy topic of the hybrid chapter, we talked about all the different ways that bioenergy can be produced and other products that can be made. So here's a schematic of the different ways that biomass can yield products and at the same time sequester carbon. So you can have biomass from agriculture or from dedicated energy crop planting, or you can use microalgae, and that can be combusted to produce electricity or power, and then the CO2 is separated and sequestered in geologic formations, or it can also be utilized. Combustion can also yield other products depending on the type of conversion that the biomass undergoes. It can yield biochar or other long-lived soil amendment products. And also there are different kinds of thermochemical conversion processes that can also yield additional products. So we have a pretty large, robust discussion of bioenergy, but we also outline some of the issues that have been brought up around bioenergy and potential solutions to those issues. So the way the innovation plan is structured is that each chapter begins with a promising, laying out the promising solutions and identifying knowledge gaps. And then it discusses short-term research needs that are anywhere between now and 3 to 5 years from now. So what are the research topics that should be explored in the near term that could lay the groundwork for subsequent research? So short-term research needs, midterm research needs is anything from for about 10 years out, and then long-term research needs are things that are about 30 years out. And a lot of times what those long-term research needs are, they require the development of earlier research agenda. So it's sort of like a time phasing of a particular topic that might be short-term, midterm, and long-term. The chapters also lay out the resources that are required to bring that research agenda to fruition, including the development of testbed networks or shared databases or other potential shared resources that the consortium can bring together that any one institution might not be able to do on their own. And then at the end of the entire innovation plan, we lay out the findings from all the chapters and specific recommendations of the sequencing of research and funding opportunities. So the goal of the innovation plan is to set an ambitious research agenda that can be enacted by a cross-cutting program through a large federal agency or a large philanthropic effort or a bunch of universities coming together and deciding to bring this research agenda to fruition. And the idea is that it's both a guide to help define the research topics of tomorrow and also potentially a funding guide to drive funds into this space. And so there was a lot of cross-cutting topics that showed up in all of the technical chapters. These included the need for life cycle analyses. Most of the solutions that were presented required really robust life cycle analyses to make sure that these solutions were actually carbon negative and that we're actually removing carbon from the atmosphere. And there isn't a lot of the life cycle analyses today are inadequate to fit the solutions that are presented, or are data poor and could benefit from more data, or use approaches that are maybe not not similar across different analysis platforms. And so there's a need to kind of build more data and a more robust life cycle analysis capacity overall. The other thing that a lot of folks noted is that a lot of the solutions that were presented would benefit from robust research agenda, but also improved economic and business models. And so that hints at the need for social science and economics and policy to really play a role in the development of a new carbon economy. All the chapters noted the need for testbed infrastructure, meaning that all of these solutions need to be tested, and actually we need to learn by doing, not just at the lab bench, but actually trying these things out in the field. So for example, for the agricultural soil carbon piece, a lot of people noted that what we really need is a US-wide soil carbon observatory across a lot of different soil types and climates and geographies, where we look at how different agricultural practices influence soil carbon storage over the long term. And so what we need to be doing the same kind of tests in a lot of different places so we can really know what's happening to soil carbon. People also noted that there was a need to develop more integrated models that include more data kinds and also shared databases so that we can more quickly have access to what other people are finding and learn by doing more quickly. And of course, everyone kind of noted that what we need to be doing is building a new generation of engineers and scientists who are thinking about these things in a more cross-cutting and interdisciplinary way. And so that was really noted in the innovation plan. And now I want to talk about the social, legal, economic, and political research gaps. So each technical chapter in the innovation plan also had a section that outlined the social science, legal, economic / policy research gaps that were not filled or could not be filled in the technical chapter, but that these topics were critical to actually bringing the research agenda to fruition and being able to enact and scale the solutions that are being presented. And as a person that wrote one of the chapters myself, I noted that the social science agenda was really important and we didn't want to overlook it. So what we're trying to do now is we have these knowledge gaps that have been identified, and what we are aiming to do is develop a similar innovation plan for the social science agenda for the new carbon economy, and have that be a really important part of the consortium and how it functions in the future. That it's not just the technology, but also the social science agenda that are really working together to bring all of these solutions to scale. So that's the end of my presentation. I think I went a lot faster than I intended. So I'm happy to answer some questions, and I'll stop the sharing.
All right, well, we have one question from the chat, which is in the engineering section, why are you focusing only on direct air capture? Why not point sources?
So as I noted, we were not comprehensive in listing every possible solution, but really trying to point out solutions that could benefit from a lot of research emphasis that are kind of in the earlier stage, that show a lot of promise once the research agenda is enacted, but that are very inadequately resourced today. So point source carbon capture is obviously a really important topic, and one that's already receiving some funding and attention, even though I would argue that it's not enough. But with carbon capture from point sources, what we're really trying to do is figure out how to make the membranes more efficient at grabbing CO2 molecules. But with direct air capture, we're really challenged by the fact that we're dealing with such low concentrations in the atmosphere. So the breakthrough kind of potential for innovation there is to develop completely different ways of capturing CO2 molecules, and that will benefit the point source capture as well.
We have another question, which is under cross-cutting topics. Why not address how policy actions mediate investment and innovation? Regulations, taxation, depreciation.
Yeah, all of those topics were absolutely noted in all of the technical chapters. And I think probably what I should have said is the need for these kinds of policy, social science, and economic research agenda to be tightly coupled with the technological agenda was spelled out very clearly in the innovation plan. And that's kind of the purpose of this webinar and then the in-person workshop in a few months. It's that we really need those things, and policy, innovation, and economic business model innovation, they will help drive the deployment of these solutions. Absolutely, and they're critical for that piece. But there's also a technical research agenda in and of itself that could benefit a lot from policy innovation, but doesn't require it to make progress on how we capture CO2 molecules.
Thank you. I submitted that question that Natalie just shared. I agree with what you said, and I appreciate your comments. It seems to me that if we have high price on carbon, or if we have belief in the business community, in the investment community, in caps on carbon and rewards for those who are able to reduce carbon emissions and offset carbon emissions and draw down carbon, then we'll see investment in innovation. So I think that the key is to signal the investment and the private finance community and the business community that there's money to be made. And if they don't perceive a regulatory push and we're going to exist in a voluntary realm, I think the flow of private capital will be weak.
I can't really argue with that, except to say that we currently don't have a regulatory environment where we have even caps on CO2 or any kind of incentives for anyone to regulate their carbon emissions. And yet we still need to continue to make progress for when that regulation framework is there, right? So whether we have the regulatory framework and the right signals to investment in capital today doesn't preclude us from making progress on the research agenda. And I think that's why we have this innovation plan, is that we spell out that, like, obviously things would be much easier if there was a price on carbon or some way for us to be able to facilitate that. But in the absence of that, we can still make progress and still continue to move the research forward. And we must do that because we have to be ready. I am hopeful that one day we will have that policy. Okay. So I think that's it for my time. Unless there are any more questions, I'm happy to answer any more.
One more question here.
Okay.
Well, I can't tell if it's on or not.
I can hear you really well, so it must be on.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'll move on. I was appreciating the large amount of attention to agriculture. I guess it goes without saying that that's a major carbon arena. That said, it seemed to me that other than feedstocks, the attention to animal husbandry, domestic and perhaps wild animals, but particularly domesticated herds, is a vastly extensive land use within the largest land use on the planet, where carbon is relevant. And was it deliberate to sort of minimize attention to animals, silvopastoralism, those kinds of things, or is just not enough room in the book?
Well, I mean, thank you for asking a question I actually have a lot of passion about. So there are huge opportunities for us to think about how we graze our domesticated animals in a way that can sequester more carbon in soils. And that means a pretty large change in just grazing and land management overall, moving away from the heavily feedstock dependent feedlot kind of operations that have a lot of emissions associated with them that can't really be offset by sequestration. So there are some big fundamental changes in how we do agriculture that would need to take place. But I would also say that with grazing, that's probably the biggest knowledge gap that we have in terms of carbon sequestration in soils in agriculture. So we know a lot more about different kinds of crop rotations and different ways of soil management in farming, but we know a lot less about ranching. We know a lot less about the impacts of grazing on soil carbon and how changing grazing practices influences soil carbon. So that is a knowledge gap that we identified in the innovation plan in the biological solutions chapter. But I agree with you. it's kind of an overwhelming but interesting opportunity to think about how we have to rethink agriculture overall and rethink how we manage animals.
All right, well, thank you for the questions and for the answers, Jane. So now I'd like to introduce Kathy Kling, who's a professor of applied economics and management. And she's going to talk to us about why we need this workshop and start to frame this workshop here.
Great. Welcome, everyone. So if you're on this call or in the room here, you probably have an awareness of the importance of social sciences, behavioral change, and institutions and policy. My first bullet was, if you build it, they will come, is not true. Technology solutions on their own, science, engineering, are critical and have to be part of how we adapt and deal with the carbon challenge. But if those things are not incentivized, if those are not adopted, then it makes absolutely no difference. So that's kind of the major story here, is we need to engage fully with social sciences and human dimensions and the research that's needed to help drive the behavioral change and institutional change that will bring this about. And additionally, I added questions like, not only will they come, but should they come? How much does carbon removal sort of technologies, how much should that play in the big picture? Is it all of it? Should we be moving entirely away from emissions reductions and instead focusing almost entirely on removal? Probably not. There are middle grounds, thinking about where some technologies will work best and where they don't. The bigger point being, of course, that this is a system, and we need to think about carbon removal in the context of the whole system. Likewise, timing, when do we invest our scarce resources in research and development, primarily in carbon removal versus other kinds of change, which technologies are the best, and so on. These are all questions about how we best manage and use the resources that we have. The current document that was shared ahead of time and is available, and that Jane just briefly stepped us through, is a document that is largely focused on hard sciences and engineering. And it was intentional early in this stage, as I understand it, to include social sciences and human dimensions. But as that document was put together, they realized they didn't have as much of the social science and human dimension expertise at the table, and therefore, when they were done putting that document together, they felt that there was an inadequate research agenda for those areas. So there is an awareness by the organizers that this is an important and critical need. My job for the next 5 minutes is to cheerlead you in the room and you on the phone to engage. Many of us social scientists, economists, and others complain when engineers and natural scientists come to us after they've developed the technology or after they have a good idea and say, we've got this solution. Will you prove that it's beneficial? Will you demonstrate society should adopt this? Will you convince people? And we said, whoa, there's a whole lot of social science questions that go before that. And this is the opportunity for all of us economists and other social scientists and people in humanities to step up early and say, what is the research agenda that needs to be developed and co-evolve with the science and engineering agenda? So that is the opportunity that we are now being put in front of us. So I really encourage you to engage, be thoughtful, collect other of your colleagues in your various circles. You have connections that we at Cornell don't. Reach out to others that you know that are interested and get their input and ideas. In the webinar announcement, there was a list of what I'm going to refer to as motivating questions. These are questions from a variety of social sciences and humanities that have been raised and that seem to capture a good breadth of the kinds of research questions and concepts that social sciences can and should contribute to an interdisciplinary program. I'm going to simply read them to give you time to process them if you haven't already given it much thought. And then I'm going to be calling for you to think about what's being omitted, what are really important aspects of these, which ones maybe are less important than others. And that's one of the things I'll be asking you to do after the next 5 minutes or so. So here's the list of questions. Again, you have them in the materials that were sent you for the webinar. Do losses from climate change associated extreme events provide incentives for transitioning to a new carbon economy? Can the risks and losses be addressed using existing policy and market mechanisms, or do new approaches need to be developed? Those are very broad, encompassing questions, and we've already heard some discussion already of those as being important framing questions. How do we implement new ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? How do we avoid substitution of those efforts with emission-reducing approaches? Again, when you think of this as a system, it isn't one size fits all or one solution. How do we think about that? And how do we be careful and thoughtful and anticipate the kinds of problems that will evolve if we focus too much on one at the absence of another? How do we change the way we design buildings, cities, and products in a new carbon economy? How do we communicate to citizens, businesses, and government regulators that this work is relevant? What are the decisions and behavioral science considerations that inform communication about CDR, carbon dioxide removal, and incentive structures to promote research development and deployment? How can the study of historical, cultural, and socio-technical transitions inform understanding of this challenge? We've been through some of these things before. Those who study those sort of changes and transitions, what can they contribute to help this time go smoother, go quicker, have some of the learned lessons brought to bear in this arena? How will CDR interact with other parts of the economy? What are the most efficient policies for stimulating research development and deployment of CDR at the many governance scales required? We don't just have a large single government in the world. We have polycentric governance. These all work together. We need to be thinking about and understanding the various roles and how they may be working together on this, and when those roles may come in conflict. How do we think about avoiding as much of that conflict as possible? How large and of what formal incentives need to be in order to meet given CDR penetration goals and/or new goals that evolve? That's a lot of stuff. It encompasses a lot of things. What I want to do now is stop talking and invite all of you to write comments in the chat group.
Or email them to Natalie if you're in the room.
Or email them to Natalie if you're in the room. And generally on the following two topics. Number one, what are your reactions to the list of questions I posed? Are there some that are very obviously to you more important than others? Are there big missing questions? Anything you have to say about those, please do. Additionally, the goal of this webinar is to collect information and thoughts to help us effectively design a workshop to be held in February. We want to have that workshop be effective and efficient. So your thoughts on how best to organize and frame that workshop would be much appreciated. Here is a couple thoughts we'll put out there for your consideration. We think a good approach might be, before the workshop occurs, to collect from people that will be at the workshop, as well as those who may not be able to attend, lists of research needs and questions that they think are critical. Use that information before the workshop to do a little bit of organizing and convening. Then, when we convene the workshop and spend time together, we can start with that set of information and ideas, and from there go towards crafting synthesis of those many ideas, and hopefully then developing cross-disciplinary research themes. Just an idea of how to go about in a big picture way to make most effective use of our time together when we actually sit down. Other ideas are welcome. If there is a problem with that strategy, please let us know. Again, I'm going to stop now and invite you to provide comments on any of this information, remembering that the goal is to provide us with information, ideas, so that we can most effectively develop a workshop agenda and run a workshop. We're not looking for answers so much today as we are, what do we need to be thinking about? How do we best prepare ourselves for a very effective full day together in a workshop? I'm going to stop and let Natalie, to some extent, take over as moderator.
So I went ahead and moved back to the motivating questions so you can think about them. And we had a point from Alan Kripnick. What is the capacity of various utilization markets to absorb carbon would be a really important question that we didn't include there. That's a good one. So also there was a question if the slides are going to be shared, and they're actually available on a Box site already. And so if you go back to your email that has the Zoom link, it also has the Box. One other question is what disciplines should we include in the workshop? And so far we've really thought of this extremely broadly, you know, human social dimensions, social scientists, planners, architects, humanists, lawyers, you know, anyone thinking on the human, societal, social science side is what we've been thinking. But that's very, very broad. And a lot of these disciplines are not used to working together regularly. So that's also an issue is what disciplines do we really think need to be at the table? There is also a question here, or a point from Dan Pleckety, I'm sure I've mispronounced that, who says, I think we should dispense with the substitution moral hazard question. CDR is complementary to mitigation, and both are necessary to hold warming to well below 2 degrees, and it's time to move past this. I think a lot of people agree with that statement. So Antonio Bento points out that one important aspect of developing incentives to achieve the goals depends on whether the projects are additional.
I guess, Antonio, can you be more specific about what you, additional to what, or how you mean that? And while maybe Antonio is answering, just from the perspective of trying to organize a new carbon economy consortium, I think it's really important for us to have a good idea of the kinds of disciplines that should be participating in an in-person workshop and the topics that we should cover, with the idea that there would be an innovation plan or something akin to that that would be developed and maybe even integrated with the technical research plan so that we can update it in a couple of years with both a technical and a social science research agenda that is much more integrated and not so siloed. What we're finding is that oftentimes the social scientists are sort of asked after the fact about things, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're working with the social science dimensions of new carbon economy early and often.
So Antonio did have time to answer that, and he was referring to the additional in terms of actually reducing emissions that would not have been reduced otherwise. So we have another comment, Sean Mooney. Do we have good ways to currently link the economic physical losses from extreme events to climate? So that's more of a climate question. And normally what we do is we talk about the statistics of a particular event being increased in the odds, and looking at the odds of an event being that extreme, we look at the statistics. But I don't know the economic literature on whether people are using then those odds with the losses to get to dollar amounts.
This also makes me think, sorry, this is Jane, this makes me think that at least the insurance industry or representatives from the insurance industry should be invited to the workshop, because I feel like these are questions that are being thought about in the insurance industry, and they're oftentimes not necessarily present in the climate change conversations that I'm participating in.
This is Kathy. Thanks both Antonio and Sean for those questions. The term additional in economics is a term that means you're not really gaining anything if you're incentivizing people to adopt and do things that they've already would be doing. And this is a real problem in policy design and in accounting for all kinds of things. So I think that's an excellent point. Thanks for raising that, Antonio. And Sean, you've done some work linking economics and soil carbon sequestration. My sense for the many other linkages that are needed is that this remains a huge problem, that the kind of integrated modeling that takes us from carbon in the atmosphere to climate change with the probabilities that Natalie talked about are there, but there still is a real dearth of models that really on many dimensions link those changes into changes that affect humans, human decision-making, human behavior, and so on. So I personally think that's going to be a very important outcome of this workshop, is to identify where we are missing those integrated assessment model components and where the most value could be gained short in doing that.
So we had a question also from Peter Lerner. How does this relate to the other CO2 removal efforts like the Global CO2 Initiative or CO2sciences.org? Jane, if you want to try to answer that.
Yeah, it's the New Carbon Economy Consortium is domestically focused at this time, and really focusing on enabling research at North American institutions. So it's not related this time, but we have had a couple of meetings in the UK, and we're starting to think more globally. But at this time, at least in the first year, we've been thinking domestically.
Let's see. So I think it's Holly Buck made a comment that it would be challenging to get engagement from all the fields you might need if the mainframe and associated questions are centered on enabling CDR, because many socialists and anthropologists working on the ground have seen devastating impacts from previous forest, carbon, and biofuels projects. A more inclusive frame would be something like assessing the social drivers and social impacts of CDR, or examining the risks. And I think we need to be very sensitive to that, because as Kathy said, we don't want the social scientists coming behind and justifying a policy if that's not actually a policy we want. So that's a really important point.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm sorry, I only answered the first part of the question. The CO2sciences.org is the University of Michigan CO2 effort, and University of Michigan is thinking about joining the New Carbon Economy Consortium. So this will hopefully be an integrated effort. Yeah, and also agree with what Holly said, absolutely. And that's why we need social scientists in the room, because even a word like enabling versus a different word is really important, and words matter. So we don't want to frame something in a way that's going to put people off.
Yeah, just my reaction is that, these are lots and lots of really, really big questions, and it's hard to think in concrete terms given that the vision is a fundamental change of the economy, and the categories are so incredibly broad that the economic incentives, the communication strategies, the policy strategies are going to differ pretty dramatically depending on which industries are involved, which stakeholders are relevant. So it's a little bit difficult to bring everyone in the room from all of these different disciplines and say, what do we need social science for, without a little more prioritization, I might say, or specification of really what are the short-term, very specific things we want to do. Is it raise money, then from who? And we can start to talk about that. Is it demonstrate a project, like a feasibility project or something like that? That opens up different kinds of social science questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe cutting it into short-term versus long-term might help with some of that posing. That's really good.
Yeah. I would also say, yes, we want to raise money to do this research. And so that's part of what the consortium is going to do, is marshal money into this space, which is currently pretty under-resourced. But we also want to catalyze research projects, and we realize that technical or hard science research isn't the only research that we should be doing. There's also a lot of social science, policy, and economics research that should be happening at the same time. So part of this is also just actually doing the research. And then that research can be used to potentially drive policy or shift market mechanisms or et cetera. But the research is really critical, and we do need to get the research funded and start moving together in a more integrated and holistic way.
So Antonio Bento has a question or a comment that implied in many questions, one needs to think about who sets policy. You talk about building cities, sectors. Would it make sense to start by focusing on a specific sector and level of government? And Sean Mooney kind of responds to that, and it might be interesting to have a discussion with urban planners as well as city managers, and they might shed light on this question. I think the multi-level governance questions and how these interact is really interesting and is coming out in the US climate change policy. I don't know if I'd want to target a specific level at this point, but maybe that's my naive science perspective here. I welcome other people's comments.
Yeah, I would just say the Atkinson Center held a workshop on the new carbon economy and the innovation plan a few months ago, and there was a planner in the room as well as a buildings designing person, and those people brought perspectives that we generally don't hear, and they were exceptionally helpful. And that prompted us to have this conversation about doing the social science work with Cornell, because those people were there, they were in the room, and if they hadn't been in the room, our conversations would have been fundamentally different.
Any other last comments here before we stop? I guess I just want to say that we've already gotten a lot of great ideas from this webinar, and that we really hope that you will continue to engage with this. And another comment just came up, but please feel free to continue the comments even after this, or send emails, because we really want to make sure that, in the first sense, we're brainstorming, so it's very broad, but in the second sense, that we cut it down to something that turns into a research plan and not just maybe a shopping list, that it's something that's really could move forward and in a cross-disciplinary sense.
Yeah, I was just going to make a suggestion that because my survey tool didn't end up working, and apologies for that, maybe it's possible for us to send out a survey to the participants after the call and get their opinions and kind of crowdsource topics and disciplines through a survey tool that isn't shared online but is sent over email. We would be happy to put that together.
That'd be great.
Well, I think that would be really good to try to synthesize some of these ideas here and get some more reactions from you. There was, I guess, one more comment there that from Peter Lehner. I'm sorry. I'm curious about the agricultural piece. For most farmers, climate change is a trigger word. So how do you engage those who do not buy into climate change and yet are critical to the solution? And I think that's a really interesting, I guess I would think of it as a communications piece, a behavioral science piece. And I think there is some literature on how to do that, but that is a really tricky question.
Yeah, I can speak from just my experience of doing this work in the Western states, especially in places like Montana and Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico and Texas, which is where I do my work. And my job is to bring farmers and ranchers together to work on soil carbon storage, but I don't talk about climate change, and I often don't mention the word carbon. But we do talk a lot about soil health and building soil organic matter and building resiliency and building a more sustainable operation. And we talk about transition planning, and as these often aging farmers and ranchers are thinking about transitioning out or transitioning their operations to their kids, how do we make sure that these operations are more sustainable by building in this sort of like forgotten nutrient, this carbon nutrient that's kind of in the soil that does all these other beneficial things. So we don't talk about climate change, we don't talk about carbon, but we do talk about soil health, we do talk about resiliency. We talk about weather and how unpredictable it is. So there are these workarounds, and they feel a little bit intellectually dishonest because I feel like we're skirting the issue, but you also have to meet people where they are, and you can't cram something down their throat that they're not ready to talk about. So you have to find common ground where you can.
And I just want to chime in and reiterate what I think Natalie said. There is a very active social science agenda in that. Sociologists work on that, and maybe in other fields as well. And in places like the Midwest, where I lived and worked with some of sociologists on this exact issue, they found that by framing it as changing in weather, it was very resonant with farmers. Farmers know the weather have changed. The planting dates are remarkably different now than they were even 20, 30 years ago. And everyone on the ground knows it. The problem with the communication is the human-caused dimension of it. And that is less important. But anyway, I'll stop there. The point is that this is definitely a researchable and important research question. And we've learned something. There's a community of scholars that works on that, and more should and can be learned. And that's the kind of thing we want to know if that should be highlighted in our workshop.
All right, well, we're over time. We appreciate everyone's involvement in this and your attention and your continued attention in this area. And we think this is a really important area to engage in, that carbon dioxide removal is not just a hard science or engineering question. It's going to require a lot of transitions that requires social scientists, planners, humanists involved. So thank you very much for coming to this, and please continue to send us ideas and engage. We really appreciate it.